Kerri, over to you.
Thank you, John. I have found myself in a position of following Steve Esty in presenting a few times, and it's always a very tough act to follow. So I'm going to do my best here and hope that what I'm going to talk about is not too boring. Before I get started, just to let everybody know who I am, my name is Kerri Joffe. I'm a staff lawyer and I work at Arch Disability Law Center. I'll tell you a little bit more about Arch on the first slide, but I was asked to talk today about one particular aspect of the CRPD process called the optional protocol. And you know, I am going to focus on the optional protocol, but I just think it's so great that we've got that broader perspective from Steve about where the CRPD fits in more broadly with some of these other UN conventions and UN mechanisms around human rights. And I think it's really important, you know, when you're coming together to think about strategies for how do we use these tools to really advance the rights of people with disabilities or the rights of injured workers domestically in Canada. We really need to look at all of the available mechanisms around the CRPD and even more broadly within the UN system, because there are a number of them. They have different functions, but you know, they're all available to us. So I'll focus on just this one, the optional protocol. Can you go to the next slide, please? Just quickly, a little bit about Arch for people who don't know Arch. Arch is a specialty legal clinic, and we practice exclusively in disability rights law. We have particular areas of law that we focus on. We give people with disabilities in Ontario who are low income free summary legal advice and referrals. We also do quite a lot of public legal education about disability rights. We do test case litigation where we go to tribunals or courts, both in Ontario and federally, to try to advance the law and advance legal protections for people with disabilities. And we also engage in what we call law reform and community development, and part of that work involves speaking to government and policymakers about laws, policies, and programs, how they impact people with disabilities, and what kinds of changes or improvements could be made so that those laws, policies, and programs really are better able to support people with disabilities and protect and promote their rights. The next slide, please. So this is a graphic image or graphic recording of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Usually we just call it the CRPD for shorthand. As Steve was saying, the CRPD it's sort of a document that tries to speak comprehensively about all kinds of rights for people with disabilities. It's quite long, and some of it is a little bit technical, or has some complex language in it. So we sometimes like to use this graphic recording of it to just give people kind of a snapshot idea about some of the rights that the convention talks about. And so some of the rights that are sort of pictured on the screen include the right to equality and non-discrimination, the right for independence and individual autonomy, including the freedom to make one's own decisions and choices, the right to the highest attainable standard of health, inclusive education, respect for the home and family, accessibility, freedom of expression, opinion, and access to information, and a whole host of other rights and freedoms in the convention. And essentially, the CRPD has 50 articles or 50 provisions that are in it, and 30 of those talk about specific rights for people with disabilities, so including some of the ones that I just described. And as Steve mentioned, Canada signed on to the CRPD in 2008, I believe. Was it 2008 or 2007, Steve? I can't remember. One of those years. 7, thank you. But only ratified the convention in a few years later in
2007, Kerri, sorry.
Thank you, 2007. So signed in 2007, but only ratified the convention in 2010. And my understanding is that in between signing in 2007 and ratifying in 2010, there was a process where the federal government was involved in consulting with the provincial and territorial governments in Canada to determine whether they were also on board or also in agreement with moving forward and agreeing to implement or follow all of the rights and freedoms contained in the convention. And when they got that agreement from the provinces and territories, they were then able to move forward and ratify the convention in 2010. So next slide, please. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to focus on the optional protocol and try to give you a sort of a bit of an overview or introduction to the optional protocol. So what is the optional protocol in the CRPD? The optional protocol really is a complaint mechanism. It sets up a complaint mechanism for violations of CRPD rights. So that means, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how that complaint actually works and what kinds of issues people have brought forward as complaints under the optional protocol. It's important to know that the optional protocol is a separate agreement from the CRPD, and so that means that, and there are a number of states that have signed on and ratified the CRPD, agreed to follow all of the rights in the CRPD in their particular country, but they've not signed on to this additional piece, this additional complaint mechanism under the optional protocol. And so each piece, the CRPD and the optional protocol, are these separate mechanisms that a state has to sign on to each one voluntarily. And indeed, that was the case with Canada. Canada, as I mentioned, ratified the CRPD in 2010, but only 8 years later, in 2018, actually signed on or acceded to the optional protocol. So between 2010 and 2018, there was no complaint mechanism available under the optional protocol for people in Canada. Steve was talking about the CRPD committee, and that's a committee of independent experts that's set up by the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I believe that committee currently has 18 members on it. These are experts from all around the world, and they're, I think, nominated by countries and then elected in a process that happens at the Conference of States Parties in New York. And one of the committee has a number of roles, but one of its main roles is to monitor how well countries are following or implementing the CRPD through that reporting process that Steve was describing. And another important role that the committee has is to receive complaints under the optional protocol and investigate and decide whether there have been CRPD violations as a result of these complaints. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So there are two types of complaints that the optional protocol sets up. The first type are called communications, and these are complaints by an individual person or a group of people, essentially going to the committee and saying, my state or my country has violated my rights under the CRPD, and then providing some information and detail about how they think the state has violated their rights. So that those communications are really focused around an individual or a group of individuals' rights and their particular experiences of a rights violation. The second type of complaint, and I'm not really sure that it's fair to actually call it a complaint. It's more of an investigation process. But the second type are called inquiries. And these are really investigations that the CRPD committee decides to undertake, where they investigate a particular state to determine whether that state has committed a serious, grave, or systemic violation of CRPD rights. Usually those are focused on a particular issue, like for example, inclusive education, or the right to an adequate standard of living, or it could be, any of the other rights under the CRPD. But it's really a process that's initiated by the committee, rather than by an individual coming forward with a complaint. So I'll talk a little bit more about each of these processes on the next slide. So communications, who can make a complaint, one of these individual or complaints about an individual or a group of individuals' rights? So as I said, it can be an individual person or a group of individuals who are personally and directly affected by a CRPD violation. There have been a number of communications that have gone forward where another person has made the complaint on behalf of the person whose rights were personally and directly violated. And that's permitted. But if that's the case, then the person who makes the complaint on behalf, they have to show that the person who's actually affected has agreed to that complaint going forward. Lots of people often have a representative for these communications. Sometimes it's a lawyer, sometimes it's a family member, sometimes it's a disability organization or some kind of civil society advocacy group that's representing the person or the group of people. And equally, there are lots of situations where the person has no representative, and they can go forward on their own, and that's perfectly fine. There are a lot of rules in the optional protocol about when people can make these complaints or communications. And these rules are quite complex. I'll just touch on them briefly today, but they really are, if you're thinking of going forward with one of these communications, these rules are really, really important to understand in a deep way, because if you don't meet all of these rules and requirements, then the committee will find that your complaint is not admissible, meaning that the committee can't address your complaint, and they'll just kind of dismiss it and say, sorry, there's nothing we can do about this. So this whole issue around following the rules and making sure that your complaint is admissible is really like a first important key step in getting your complaint before the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities under the optional protocol. So what are some of these rules? The first one is that you can only bring forward a communication or an individual complaint if that same complaint has not already been made to the CRPD committee or to another UN body. So, that's a fairly kind of usual rule that we see in a lot of legal proceedings where there's a concern around using resources efficiently, and they don't want people making the same complaint in lots of different places. They just want the complaint being dealt with by one particular body. Another one of these rules around admissibility is that you can only bring forward a complaint about events that happened after the optional protocol came into force in your particular country. And so for Canada, that date is December 3rd, 2018. That's the date that Canada acceded to the optional protocol. And so generally we would say that events that happened on or after December 3rd, 2018 could go forward into an optional protocol complaint. There's also an exception to that rule that there are situations where an event occurred before December 3rd, 2018, but then because of the particular circumstances continued occurring, or events very closely connected to it that are violations of the CRPD continued occurring after December 3rd, 18. And so in some cases, those kinds of complaints are also eligible to go forward. Another important rule is that the only type of complaints that the committee will deal with are complaints about a violation of CRPD rights. So they won't look at issues where a person is complaining about something that may well be a rights violation but isn't actually provided for in the CRPD. And one of the key rules, and this has been the subject of lots and lots of discussion at the CRPD committee, and also in some of the writing about these communications, is that the only time you can go forward with this complaint is if you've exhausted all of your domestic remedies. And that's kind of a complex rule to unpack, but essentially it means that the person bringing forward the complaint has to have gone through all of the relevant mechanisms and complaint procedures in Canada first before going to the optional protocol. So we're talking about legal proceedings, like for example going to court or making a human rights complaint to a tribunal or a commission, or it could include administrative complaint procedures. It could include, and it will really depend on the particular issue in question and what legal or complaint mechanisms are actually available in Canada and in the jurisdiction that you're in, the province or territory that you're in, to address that particular problem. Can we go to the next slide? So I wanted to give you an example, tell you a story about one of the communications that the CRPD committee has dealt with, just to give you a sense of the kinds of issues that are coming forward and how the committee addresses them. So this is communication called number 19/2014. Not a very snazzy name, and it's about a woman named Fiona Gibbon who is an Australian woman, and she brought forward a complaint alleging that Australia had violated her right to vote secretly, independently, and on an equal basis as others. And Fiona, or Miss Gibbon, I should call her, is a woman with cerebral palsy. She had limited muscle control and dexterity, and she also did not speak. She used an electric wheelchair for mobility, and she also used an electronic synthetic speech generating device for communication. So this complaint, the events happened in 2013 when Australia held an election, and Ms. Gibbon went to a polling station with her attendant. She intending to vote, and she wanted to vote by secret ballot. As is the case in Canada, Australia guarantees that right to every eligible elector to vote in secret. However, due to her limited muscle control because of her cerebral palsy, she could not mark the paper ballot on her own, nor could she fold it or put it into the ballot box without some assistance. And she needed assistance to do that, but when she went to the polling station, she did ask whether she could use an electronic voting machine which would have allowed her to vote secretly and independently without assistance from anybody else. No electronic voting machine was available at the polling station that day, and so instead she requested the help of the polling officer to help her mark her ballot, fold it, and deposit it into the ballot box. The polling officer refused, saying that it was just too busy, they didn't have time to help her, and they suggested that she instead get assistance from her attendant. Ms. Gibbon did not want this assistance from her attendant because she didn't want to disclose her vote to her attendant. Her attendant was somebody that she had to maintain a close, productive working relationship with over many years, and she didn't want that that person knowing who she had voted for. In the end, she was required to vote with the assistance of her attendant because the polling officer refused to help her. And she went through a series of complaints domestically within Australia to basically arguing that that requiring her to vote with the assistance of her attendant had violated her right to vote independently. Those complaints failed, and in the end, she filed communication under the CRPD optional protocol. The committee found that Australia had violated her right to vote by secret ballot on an equal basis as others, and the committee relied on a number of articles of the convention, including the provision on equality and non-discrimination, the right to accessibility, and the right to participate in political and public life. There are a number of kind of really interesting threads to this communication, which I wouldn't mind talking about if people are interested in hearing about it later on. But I think just in the interest of time, maybe I'll move on to the next slide. So to give you just a little bit more information about the inquiry process, and just so that you recall, this is the process where the CRPD, nobody brings forward a particular complaint about an individual set of circumstances, but instead this is a process where the CRPD committee decides to initiate an investigation into whether a particular state has violated the rights of persons with disabilities in a systematic, grave, or serious manner. And the committee will decide to initiate an inquiry only if it has received reliable information that a state has seriously or systematically violated CRPD rights. That information sometimes comes to the state, sometimes comes to the committee from civil society and NGO actors like disability advocacy groups. Sometimes comes to the committee from national human rights institutions, and sometimes comes to the committee from organizations that have been appointed by the state to be the independent monitoring mechanism for the CRPD. So the CRPD actually requires that each country that has ratified it appoint an independent body to monitor how well the state is implementing the provisions of the rights of the convention. And those independent monitoring bodies sometimes will forward information to the CRPD committee about what's happening on the ground in a particular state.
About 5 more minutes, please, Kerri.
Sure, thanks, John. Maybe I'll tell you, we can go on to the next slide. Maybe I'll just tell you a little bit about one of the inquiries. There's actually only been 2 inquiries that the CRPD committee has sort of completed and reported on to date. One of them was in Spain, and it dealt with the right to inclusive education. And the other one was in the UK and Northern Ireland. That inquiry happened in 2017, and it focused mainly on the rights to live independently in the community, the right to an adequate standard of living and social protection, and the right to work and employment. And essentially, it was an inquiry that examines the cumulative impact of a whole bunch of changes that happened in the UK and Northern Ireland, including legal changes and policy changes to a wide variety of social security schemes, income support benefits, and work and employment provisions. And many of those changes were I guess what we would call in the nature of austerity measures, and really had significant and widespread detrimental impacts on people with disabilities in the UK and Northern Ireland. And so the committee, the CRPD committee visited the UK in October 2015, interviewed over 200 people, including government representatives, NGO representatives, representatives of national human rights institutions there, and to try to get a sense of how these changes were impacting people and whether they actually did amount to a violation of those CRPD rights. And in the end, the committee found that there had been a violation and made a whole series of broad recommendations to the state, including, for example, recommendations like the state should conduct an impact assessment of all the measures, all the changes that had been made and how they were affecting people with disabilities. They should take action to ensure that any intended welfare reforms were based on a model of rights rather than a human rights approach, rather than an sort of benefit or charity kind of model approach. And they should do all of this in a manner that really that involved and allowed people with disabilities to participate and consult in that process, and also allowed people with disabilities to participate in a process to help kind of design some response or some changes to these reforms. Some of these recommendations of the committee have really been kind of criticized as being overly broad, and it's difficult to know what the actual impact of these recommendations by the committee has actually been in the UK and Northern Ireland. We're actually in a process at Archserve speaking to a number of disabled persons organizations in Ireland and in Wales to try to find out, how that inquiry and those recommendations have helped to the community on the ground to really advocate and push the government to implement some of these changes. I don't have an answer for you today, but I certainly am very interested in trying to find out more about this and in reporting back to people about it. So can we just go to the last, I think this is my last slide, yeah. So just to give you a quick sense, you can go through these sort of two complaint mechanisms under the optional protocol, the communication, individual complaint process, and the inquiry. And really, at the end of both of those, the committee will make a decision about whether it thinks the state in question has violated the CRPD rights that are the subject of that complaint. And if it finds that there has been a violation, then it will make recommendations. Those recommendations usually include both what we would call individual remedies. So they can include things like, if it's a communication and there's an individual person involved, it might include things like telling the state to pay the person's legal fees to bring forward the complaint, telling the state to take steps to stop whatever the CRPD violation or discrimination is that's taking place. And in terms of systemic remedies, the committee usually makes recommendations that look at steps or measures the state should take to prevent future violations of CRPD rights. So for example, it might recommend changing a particular law or policy or program that is really having a detrimental impact on people with disabilities. Really important to note that all of these outcomes are recommendations only. So they are not binding on the state, and it's up to the state to really decide which of those recommendations they want to implement and which they just decide to ignore. So like a lot of things in the international law process, this is really more about kind of naming and shaming and using moral persuasion to try to convince states to take action, rather than creating some kind of legally binding order that a state must implement. Can we go to the next slide? Oh, thank you. I guess my presentation is done, so I hope I think I'm within the time. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions or engage in more conversation about this as the as the afternoon unfolds.
Thank you, Kerri, for all the information that you provided. I don't know about the rest of you who are participating here. You raised a number of questions in my mind, but I'll hang on to them for now. I hope that as time goes on, you can succeed in finding out more about how things have unfolded with the Irish example that you gave us. 'Cause it would be good to know more about that, concrete example and just how it ultimately unfolds. So thank you for a splendid presentation.